Thank you so much to everyone who has joined this evening. Welcome. I'm Miriam Brett. I am a co-director at Future Economy Scotland, and I'm really delighted to kick this webinar off, where we will be discussing the role of carbon offsetting in a just transition. Protecting and restoring nature has obviously a very vital role to play in accelerating Scotland's transition to net zero, while also delivering benefits to local communities. And in recent years, Scotland has become a particularly attractive destination for investors seeking to purchase land for carbon offsetting and natural capital activities. And this has generated fresh questions around the extent to which carbon credits generated in Scotland are delivering both environmental and community benefits. So this webinar will focus on that, as well as the policy levers required to ensure that carbon offsetting plays a really constructive role in meeting Scotland's climate and nature targets. We are absolutely thrilled to be joined by an expert panel this evening. They all wear many hats and have huge amounts of accomplishments, so I'm just going to be reading their top line titles. So we will be joined this evening by Dr. Jill Robbie. Jill is a Professor of Property Law and Natural Environment at the University of Glasgow. We will then be hearing from Ailsa Rayburn. Ailsa is the chairperson at Community Land Scotland and the chair of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust. We will then be hearing from Dr. Callum Brown. Callum is the co-scientist at Highlands Rewilding and a senior researcher in land use and climate change. And last but by no means least, Dr. Theo Stanley. Theo is an environmental social scientist who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Southampton. Following hearing from each of our speakers, we're going to move into a discussion. And I would ask you to submit your questions in the Q&A box, because we have a lot of people attending this webinar, which is fantastic, but does leave us with limited time to get through everyone's questions. What I'll be doing is keeping an eye on the Q&A box and making sure that we are kind of grouping together themes of questions to ask the participants as part of the discussion. So please remember to submit your questions. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Jill Robbie.
Thanks so much, Miriam. So I've just got 10 minutes to talk about some aspects of carbon markets from a legal perspective. And I'm a co-author of a report on carbon markets, land ownership and the public interest, which I was commissioned by the Scottish Land Commission to write in 2022, where I explore some of the issues that I talk about today. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of the issues that are talked about in that report. So just a reminder of what we're talking about. We're talking about the voluntary carbon market today, and what that is it's a market which enables businesses to offset their CO2 emissions, which ideally that they can't avoid, by buying carbon units from other people in the market. So there are two codes currently operating in a UK context where carbon units are generated and available for purchase and for offsetting. And these are the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code. Both these codes are aiming to trigger widespread woodland creation, peatland restoration in order to sequester carbon or reduce emissions. I think it's always important to remember that these carbon markets don't operate in isolation. They operate in the context of other forestry practices, peatland practices. Planting and restoring peat can also be supported by public subsidies. And of course, in the context of Scotland, whenever we talk about land, we have to remember that the distribution of land in Scotland is unequal. And so there are many government policies trying to tackle this inequality. So back to voluntary carbon markets, there's no legislation which governs carbon trading in this way. Instead, again, as I just said, it's just these two codes and then the UK Land Carbon Registry, which is the framework on which the generation of value through woodland creation and peatland restoration is made. So the governance infrastructure is just really these two codes and the registry, which is a website. The registration, validation, and verification processes in the codes, which are outlined in the codes, create the carbon units, and then the UK Land Carbon Registry is the platform through which these units are sold. So the whole system is really relying on the existing laws, guidance, such as environmental law, property law, contract law, as well as guidance, very valuable guidance on community engagement, for example, from the Scottish Land Commission and other bodies. So these laws and guidance are different in Scotland to the other devolved nations. We haven't yet got to recognising carbon units as property, but it's the validation and verification processes that are the ways in which the units are created and traded through a series of contracts between the landowner and developer and the buyer of the units. So from my perspective, these processes are really, really crucial for thinking about how to steer some of the negative consequences of carbon trading. The landowner in a carbon trading or a carbon sequestration project is a crucial figure. They are the person who gives consent to a carbon project on their land, and this gives rise to a number of different policy issues. So one of the central questions that was asked of me is how effectively are carbon markets operating in Scotland and around the world? It's difficult for me to generalise about what's happening around the world, but it's also been hard to ignore news stories of carbon offsets being really just phantom credits, not representing actual carbon reductions. There's also a question about whether carbon offsetting justifies business as usual and doesn't require organisations to really think seriously about how they actually reduce their emissions. In a Scottish context, the fears that have been circulating was organisations buying large tracts of land in order to implement carbon offsetting projects. This seemed to have its peak around 2021, and behaviour then started to change according to the Scottish Land Commission and its Rural Insights reports. Apparently now more applications for carbon schemes are from either existing landowners and farmers, or there's also partnerships between companies forming partnerships with landowners instead of purchasing land themselves. So the second question I've been asked is, are carbon markets delivering desired outcomes for nature, and have there been any adverse consequences? I suppose the starting point is that carbon markets are not necessarily about biodiversity. So the intention of carbon markets is to sequester CO2 emissions. They're not primarily about nature restoration per se. The developer could take it upon themselves to make sure that the whole carbon offsetting process is done in the most biodiverse and nature restorative way possible, but that is not necessary in a sense. It's a principle of the codes that the project should be of high environmental quality. There might be an environmental impact assessment that needs to be undertaken, but the verification and validation processes, which are the ones that generate the carbon units, they're not checks on whether environmental law has been complied with, and there's no requirement in terms of monitoring of environmental benefits over the course of the project. So one perspective you might have is that there needs to be a lot more oversight in terms of the cumulative impacts of carbon trading or these projects in terms of biodiversity at landscape scale. So are there any adverse environmental consequences? I don't think we necessarily know, because nobody's doing the systematic overview or monitoring of the impact of carbon trading on biodiversity, for example. Anything else that I'm worried about in this context? Well, we know that community engagement and community empowerment are key priorities in Scotland, with the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement around among other key policy documents. And meaningful collaborative community engagement is really crucial for decisions about land. Um, if we are thinking about long-term intergenerational impacts, then you want to have real co-design of these kind of land projects. The Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code often involve long-term land use change so that a developer can sell carbon units, and that can lock in a land use for a long period of time. So permanency is a really important part of the codes. Woodland projects can last up to 100 years. So it's really obvious that there will be significant intergenerational impacts on communities. And a concern I have is that it's very difficult to factor in community impacts over such a long period of time. The community that's consulted at the start of the project is not the community who will be there in 30 or 50 years' time. There may be community needs like requirement for extra housing, community facilities, or other land use conflicts that might arise in the future, especially in the context of climate change, when our land uses might be a changing context over the next 100 years. So the balance of permanency for the project and the need for flexibility, I think, is a really, really challenging problem to solve. The final issue is with implementation of carbon units is distribution of benefits. So as I said, you've got this key figure who is for the consent and implementation of the projects are the landowners. And then if you have the context of Scotland, where we have a high concentration of land in the hands of very few, there's a risk for carbon units to carbon markets to be an additional source of income to those who already own a significant amount of natural resources. So in an abstract model of incentivizing change, it makes sense. But if you then apply it in a context of inequality, you can see that there's a potential for exacerbating inequalities because those who are able to develop these projects and get the advice and set them up and do the trading are those who already have a lot of resources. A flip side of this is that it can often be very difficult for a community to prove that it has a good source of income, a sustainable source of income, in order to provide a business case for community buyouts. And in that way, communities can use carbon trading in order to provide that source of income and provide that business case for supporting things like community rights to buy. But they often will need significant support to navigate carbon trading as a sophisticated situation. So any policy levers that I could think about to meet these challenges, one option, which I've talked about in a couple of other contexts, is about a public carbon trust. So this would be the government taking a much stronger role in the management of carbon trading and its governance, so that once units are created, they could be held in trust, either nationally or perhaps preferably at a more local level by local authorities or some other body. These authorities would then have control over who buys the units and how to react to impacts in trading that's being felt locally. And I think the more I think about carbon trading and perhaps other things in a land use context in Scotland, what I'm trying to make sure is are as close as possible to each other are the impacts and the benefits. So if you have a benefit of a land use change carbon unit, then you want to make sure that the person who's feeling the impact is as close to the benefit. So if you make this kind of local carbon trading, you could almost have almost a circular economy of carbon, and so you could have carbon neutral or even carbon positive crofting through peatland restoration, for example, but it's only on a specific island or within a specific local authority area. There could also be real encouragement and support for communities to be a partner or a lead in carbon projects. And I think that would allow, again, the more community-led governance in this space and keep that impact and benefit loop much closer. I will end here and let others give their perspective, but happy to answer the questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jill. That set us up really nicely for the discussion, questions arising around intergenerational impacts on communities, the distribution of benefits when land ownership's so concentrated, and ideas around public alternatives. Really great food for thought. So I'm going to hand over to Ailsa now.
Thanks, Miriam. Hopefully you can see my screen and the presentation okay. That was a really helpful introduction, Jill. Thank you for that, for setting the scene, identifying some of the challenges within the system. As Miriam's already said, I'm the chair of Community Land Scotland and chair of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust. And actually, we've already been active in this market, and we worked with the Woodland Trust to sell some of our carbon credits a couple of years ago. And that was quite interesting, testing some of the issues that we're talking about today. Community Land Scotland, we're the representative voice of Scotland's community landowners, and we have a whole range of members across all of urban and rural Scotland, many of whom are now starting to think about carbon markets. They've been approached either by developers or investors, and they're looking for guidance and support on what they should do. And some communities are much further ahead in these considerations, and particularly supported by the brilliant Ferns programme from Nature Scot. Community Land Scotland, we know the climate emergency and the associated biodiversity decline is both existential crises deserving of significant public policy development. And as I said, many of our members are already active in addressing these issues in a whole variety of ways. And we certainly think that more communities should have the opportunity to be leaders in climate and biodiversity action. Community owners already utilise private sources of finance for investment purposes, and we actually have no principled objection at all to the utilisation of private finance into nature and net zero activity. However, as Jill's already mentioned, that private finance must support the achievement of related public policy goals, which build and retain wealth in communities and Scotland more widely. And wider policy questions arise when public finance is in the mix and is required to enable or even underwrite a private market based on carbon credits from which large private profits will be extracted. This is what people are calling the de-risking of private investment by public finances. So these concerns are only exacerbated really by a lack of exploration of other policy mechanisms to achieve Scotland's nature, its climate, and its land ownership diversification targets. So there's a lot in this mix, as Jill's already mentioned. So we've been working with a whole range of partners for some time now, thinking about the impact of carbon markets on Scotland's communities and Scotland's land market. Those discussions have led us to identify three sort of factors which are currently influencing carbon market development, but perhaps need more rigorous examination as to how far they should be influencing the carbon market development in Scotland. And the first is overstated financial pressures. Now, many of you might have heard of the £20 billion requirement, which was a figure from the Green Finance Institute. That was the finance gap for nature and climate in Scotland. Publicly available research from the Scottish Government reveals an ambition for £12.5 billion of investment over the next 8-year period to 2032. And that sort of reflects that £20 billion figure. That equates to £1.5 billion annually investment. So our view is achieving this level of investment at best seems improbable when set against the achievement of current planning and peatland restoration, which is currently running at about just over £50 million a year. So we'd need to deliver that £1.5 billion annually through to 2032, an immediate gearing up of delivery by over 3,000%. We don't think that's credible. And any job creation or wider economic benefits potential using these figures will be unrealistic. Now, Future Economy Scotland, our partners here on the webinar, have already previously estimated that this figure, the finance gap for nature and climate, could be as little as £118 million a year, which actually amounts to only 0.2%. These figures are slightly out of date of the Scottish Government's annual budget. So, but whether the gap is millions or billions actually has a really significant repercussion, both on the scale of the private finance gap required and how much public finance needs to de-risk it. We also know there's quite a number of non-financial reasons for the lack of take-up in the carbon market. Much of the policy discourse at the moment focuses on how we can leverage in private finance through carbon credits to natural capital projects. But the issue isn't simply a financial one. We know that the woodland and peatland grant schemes continue to be underspent, and work has been undertaken to look at why that is the case. We know, as Jill's already mentioned, other considerations, both for community and private landowners, are the necessary very long-term commitment to the land use involved, which often involves standard security over land for up to 100 years. The policy at the moment and the financial and reputational risks are still quite immature. The Scottish Government have done some really brilliant work on the market framework, together with the Scottish Land Commission, on the principles for responsible investment. So a theme is emerging as to how the carbon market should develop in Scotland, but it is still at quite a young age. And therefore, we're seeing some uncertainty in the market and also uncertainty with landowners as to whether or not they want to commit for those sorts of periods. The current carbon price, perhaps reflecting all of that, is generally not currently at a high enough level to support viable investment propositions. So again, this causes nervousness, particularly amongst more traditional landowners. And then there's things, really quite basic things, like a lack of suitable tree saplings for woodland planting, and a lack of skills and labour supply to undertake all of the necessary dimensions to the work. So there's a whole range of factors which are non-financial, which are also impacting on the development of the carbon market. And then finally, the other area that we've been spending a bit of time on is understanding that link between encouraging private finance and the impact on public spending. We know that the challenges I've just outlined don't deliver at the moment commercially investable propositions with the returns that private financiers are looking for. Now, I exclude from that philanthropic financiers who perhaps are looking at this slightly differently, but even they are struggling to make a business case for some of this work. Research commissioned by the Scottish Government has argued that public money needs to be used to de-risk private finance through guaranteeing carbon prices, operating payments, or first loss capital. But this has potentially really serious implications for public expenditure, and actually could end up being much more expensive than just the state itself investing in carbon markets, driving nature restoration and climate action. So we think there are three areas that, again, picking up what some of Jill has said, complementary policy approaches that could make carbon markets work better. And Jill's already talked about land use reform. And that's not just about diversification of ownership and the better sharing of benefits, although that's a key part of it, but it could be about reducing the costs. So reducing deer numbers as opposed to planting and fencing, the progressive realignment of agricultural support to deliver more nature-friendly practices, the regulation of greenhouse gas emitting land, and things like the carbon emission land tax that the John Muir Trust is currently proposing. There are a range of fiscal measures, things around cross-compliance and reduction of subsidies for large-scale commercial coniferous forestry in favour of enhanced subsidy support for smaller-scale mixed productive woods, a refocusing of the Scottish National Investment Bank activity, the encouragement of direct UK or Scottish-led green investment, with the public taking any return from investments. And I'm really interested in Jill's proposals there. Things like a biodiversity bond, an increased role for Scottish Government in the ownership and management of land for nature, land valuation principles, reformed ownership and joint ventures. There's lots of different models that actually could help address some of the concerns that Jill outlined so well at the start. So what we have done within Community Land Scotland, we've started looking at how land use reform, and through the Land Reform Bill and other mechanisms, Fiscal measures around tax and cross compliance measures could be used to drive behaviours, but also how we can take a sort of more positive and proactive approach to developing partnerships between landowners and investors and developers and communities to address some of those issues that Jill outlined around community engagement and empowerment, allegations of greenwashing and community washing, and also how the market at the moment is just exacerbating existing inequalities and not doing anything to address the core Scottish Government policies around growth, economic growth, which is spread more equitably across all communities in Scotland. So we produced some papers based on what we call the Thriving Communities Partnership Model, and that recognised all of those challenges and complexities and developed a concept of a model partnership, which would allow communities and developers or investors to come together to explore ways of supporting investment in natural capital, addressing the skills and knowledge gap, and finding a shared language. So giving local people a voice in land use change and ensuring we share the benefits of the land use change. The idea was well received as a new way of working in partnership between landowners, investors, developers, and communities. And also, all of the people that we spoke to saw merit in the need to actually just step back and perhaps rethink some of these engagements and partnerships and what it could look like. Learning from early models, and we're going to hear a bit from Callum about the good work they've been doing in locations they're operating, and looking at ways in which we could develop a more equitable distribution of resources to build community wealth while simultaneously addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. We developed the idea of a natural capital partnerships programme. Now, this is specifically members of staff on the ground. I'll tell you who's funding it next, but with experience in community engagement and crofting and agriculture and marine carbon and the natural capital market, to bring all sides together to see how we can best address some of the issues that Jill has outlined. This would be an action research approach, so we'd continue to iterate suggestions around policy as projects develop, and one of the principal outcomes would be to develop and disseminate best practice amongst communities, landowners, developers, investors, and very importantly, policymakers. Now, the main funders for the programme, Esme, Fairbairn and Foundation Scotland, both of whom you'll probably know are big grant foundation trust funders of this type of work in Scotland, but also statutory agencies, Scottish Forestry, High, South Scotland Enterprise, recognising the community benefits potential in this work. So I'm just going to finish up now. This is an idea of some of the project outcomes. Again, hopefully it reflects what we've been talking about already in terms of what we should be looking to deliver from effective and engaged carbon markets in Scotland. Thanks very much, Miriam. I'll pass back over to you.
Thank you so much, Ailsa. That was, really, really useful delve into some critical areas in this discussion, the de-risking of private finance by public finances and the problems embedded with an overstated nature finance gap. And of course, questions around much needed land use and fiscal reform. I'm conscious of time here, so I'm going to hand over to Callum.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Callum Brown. As Miriam said, I'm co-chief scientist at Highlands Rewilding. And for a bit of background, Highlands Rewilding is a private company working on nature restoration and community prosperity through rewilding in Scotland. In its 5 years of existence, it hasn't sold any carbon offsets or carbon credits. So I'm certainly not here to represent carbon offsetting, but I will try and give a perspective from an organization involved in this kind of area on the topic, and a sort of cautious outline of how voluntary carbon markets could contribute to climate change mitigation and a just transition. We've all been given 3 questions to answer, as you've heard, but before getting on to how effective carbon markets are, I think it's worth underlining how ineffective our entire approach to climate change mitigation is. This plot comes from Climate Action Tracker, summarising the UK's progress towards the Paris climate goals, and you can see that we're rated as, our policies and our action are rated as insufficient currently, even for a 3 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. So we're way off the mark here. And, carbon markets are secondary to this terribly urgent need to actually reduce emissions in line with the commitments that we've made. But then we also have, large land use emissions. We have large areas of degraded peatland in Scotland. We've lost lots of forest cover. So and these have been driven relentlessly by economic pressures towards degradation and away from restoration, and nature recovery. And we need to reverse those. And at the same time, we need to recognize that while we reduce emissions, there will be so-called residual leftover emissions that we effectively can't do without. And that if we can use money to offset these residual emissions by restoring ecosystems, then we potentially have a win-win situation. And there are some key requirements for that to happen that I think are fairly well known, and Jill and Ailsa have touched on some of these, but I think chief among them is the mitigation hierarchy shown on the right-hand side here. That's basically, setting out that offsetting is almost the last resort. First we have to reduce emissions, and only in the end, when we can't do that anymore, can we legitimately offset them. So offset should be used in this context. It's really important that we recognize that land-based carbon sequestration or storage is not equivalent to fossil fuel emissions. So woodlands and peatlands, we need to restore their ability to store carbon. That's a really urgent priority. But it's not the same thing as keeping fossil fuels, carbon, locked in fossil fuels in the ground and not burning it. So we can't offset these things one to one. And we also need rigorous, independent, transparent methods to ensure these are applied across the board. As these things develop, there's lots of other actors working towards their own standards, principles. As an example, this is the Highlands Rewilding Buyers Charter. Again, it's not dedicated specifically to carbon markets, but a more general interaction with markets. And in this case, we've identified 10 principles we think are crucial to make sure that anything that's being sold is having the desired impacts. And as you see, these reference standards and principles developed by other independent bodies. And this is increasingly happening, and the sort of concentration on a shared set of standards is really important across the board. The second question we were asked to answer was whether carbon markets are delivering desired benefits. And before going on to adverse consequences, there is clearly a case that they are. Again, coming back to the Woodland Carbon Code example that the others have spoken about, this has now supported 656 projects according to their website in the UK, many of which are run by community groups, conservation charities, other bodies who are doing great work and who are struggling to finance that work in any other way. And this influx of money into restoration clearly can have or should have substantial benefits for nature and for people. Notwithstanding, there may then be problems with how the resulting offsets are handled in the market. But there can also be adverse consequences that we've seen in this country and around the world, including mitigation deterrence. So if we completely incorrectly get the idea that we don't need to worry so much about reducing emissions because we can just offset them. Focusing on carbon as a theoretically measurable thing at the expense of other environmental and social goals. And that can lead, for example, to carbon plantations that might maximize carbon storage, but don't, or actually could work against environmental outcomes. And as we've heard as well, it introduces yet another pressure on a limited land resource, increasing competition for land and potentially land prices. And I think we need to bear in mind all these things are happening anyway, and we have to get to grips with them with or without carbon markets, but there's clearly a potential for them to contribute to these. The policy levers required. I think it's worth noting how bad we are in the UK and in Scotland at actually using policy levers in this context. We have enormous pressures, as I've mentioned, on limited areas of land. The Royal Society has estimated we need new area of land twice the size of Wales by 2050 just to meet our current commitments for food, timber, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and so on. And there are again and again these reports, committees and so on, pointing out that we don't have coherent strategies to achieve these things. So the Environmental Audit Committee quote there is talking about the timber sector, We're the world's second largest net importer of timber, and global demand's, I think, set to increase fourfold in the coming decade. So, massive pressure there again on our land resource and no coherent sectoral strategy. The UK Climate Change Committee has identified these vast policy gaps over and over again, all to do with not joining up thinking across policy areas, particularly agriculture, land use, climate, nature, leading to us missing and eventually scrapping climate goals as we go. So I think there are lots of policy levers, and Jill and Ailsa pointed out several really important ones already. A few more examples I would throw in. I think top of the pile, genuinely binding carbon targets and genuinely integrated land use policies to ensure that they work along with everything else. And there are some movements in this direction. I think the DEFRA land use framework that was released last week moves a bit in this direction. The Climate and Nature Bill that didn't proceed in Westminster recently would have been a good example. And as others have mentioned, the land reform bill in Scotland that's currently in progress is really important for addressing this fundamental inequality in land ownership and associated power and so on. Then more specifically to carbon markets, there are emerging principles for voluntary markets from the government and from others, embedded, for example, in the Scottish Government's natural capital market framework. Community inclusion standards, particularly coming out of the Ferns funding that Ailsa mentioned. The core carbon principles shown here on my slide, I think sort of nicely capture many of the issues I've mentioned already. So adoption of these kinds of principles would be important. And then again, echoing Ailsa's talk, the carbon emissions land tax proposed by the John Muir Trust, gives more of a stick component to the carrot and stick process of making degradation emissions economically viable and begins to push us in the opposite direction, which is where we need to be. So there's a lot of potential in these things, I think, to making carbon markets and other approaches work better for climate, but also for a just transition. And I think a sort of final observation is that recently we've seen movement away from these principles and these objectives in democracies. And it's clearly important that all of us, whether engaged in the market or projects or whatever, to put whatever pressure we can on our representatives and governments to keep going in this direction and actually commit to achieving these things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Callum. It was really, really interesting to hear about. Well, I suppose firstly from the guidance around Highlands rewilding and the approach that you're taking, the challenges, the lack of coherent strategy, and policy options to move forward, like community inclusion standards, particularly, as you rightly point out, in a wider environment that is looking increasingly dangerous globally around the race to net zero, and particularly around the need for a just transition and how we deliver that in the current context. I will now hand over to our final speaker, Theo.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have the unenviable task of following people who've been speaking about the subject already. So I might repeat a few things. I guess some background. My name's Theo Stanley. I recently completed my PhD at Oxford, where I was researching the politics of carbon finance and nature recovery in Scotland. My work, I interviewed people from across the land sector, from a range of forestry, rewilding, community and ecological organisations. And my main investigation was understanding how the carbon code was being used, to understand what the effects were on nature and communities. So to understand what was happening in Scotland, I read widely about the performance and functioning of carbon markets around the world. And I'm hoping some of those insights will help me answer the three questions I've been offered. So firstly, how effectively are carbon markets operating in Scotland and around the world today? Well, the first thing that a social scientist does is think, well, what does effectiveness mean? And who gets to decide what it means? So people have very different ideas about what an effective carbon market looks like. Perhaps in its purest terms, an effective carbon market is one which sells offset units which are actually linked to increased carbon being sequestered or stored in ecosystems. So it sounds simple, but it's a lot harder to achieve than you might expect. there have been widespread accusations of fraud, data fudging, lies, miscalculation, overestimation of carbon storage, and cronyism across the carbon market worldwide for at least the last 20 years. Even recently in 2023, a Guardian investigation found that 90% of the credits generated by Vera, the world's biggest certifier of carbon credits, were actually phantom credits, i.e., they had no link to material reality whatsoever. So, how does this land back in Scotland? Well, in response to the growing scrutiny of carbon markets worldwide, the Woodland Carbon Code has been really carefully designed to ensure that its calculations are highly conservative. So, in interviews with me, the code's early and current developers stress that the code has been designed to the highest possible standards to ensure that it can withstand close public examination. So, in that regard, compared to other carbon codes in other countries, the Woodland Carbon Code in the UK really excels in undercounting emissions, and it strategically avoids measurement uncertainty, which can delegitimize the value of credits it makes. So, for that reason, the Scottish carbon market is one of the highest integrity carbon markets in the world. But in Scotland, as elsewhere, success or effectiveness for a carbon market is a bit difficult to pin down. It doesn't only relate to whether a carbon credit is linked to material carbon stored. In recent years, and increasingly more, effectiveness has taken on a new meaning, i.e., carbon markets are effective not only because they trade in carbon, but because they deliver social and ecological benefits. So the question follows, how effective actually are carbon markets for financing nature restoration? So in purely economic terms, which is a really reductive framing I normally avoid because it simply makes everything about monetary figures, carbon markets aren't an effective way of addressing climate change or biodiversity loss. So according to the latest UNEP State of Finance for Nature report, there's $7 trillion being pumped into so-called nature negative activities a year, including harmful subsidies and extractive practices, compared to 200 billion invested in so-called nature positive activities. 7 trillion, that's 7,000 billion, 200 billion for nature positive. The overwhelming majority of that nature positive finance comes from public expenditure from governments, and only 35 billion comes from private companies. So 7 trillion, 200 billion, 35 billion. And of this, the entire worldwide carbon market is worth $1.5 billion. So less than 1% of all money directed towards nature positive activities comes from the carbon market. And I think something like 0.02% of the finance for compared to nature negative activities is produced from the carbon market. So the important point here is that carbon markets take up an enormous amount of discursive space about financing nature restoration, as indeed my PhD and this webinar prove. But realistically, even if they function at their most optimized level, they'll only provide a tiny fraction of the finance required to restore nature, in big global terms. Anyway, moving away from kind of global structural critique, leads me to the second question. Are carbon markets delivering the desired outcomes for nature, and have there been any adverse consequences? Again, the most important question here for a social scientist is, what are the desired outcomes for nature and who gets to decide? Is simply the fact that projects are being passed through the code and equivalent to the desired outcomes being reached? Is simply increasing the amount of hectares covered in trees the actually desired ecological outcome? So in my interviews, lots of representatives from nature restoration organizations were excited that there's more finance available for native woodland creation. This is especially true for smaller scale community organizations who often wanted to create native woodland but were kind of financially forced into turning towards commercial non-native timbers. So in a sense, the code does provide a real financial lifeline for some community groups, as Elsa mentioned. But in Scotland, as is the case elsewhere, the carbon market leads to ecological streamlining. forests are grown in ways which produce the most legible amounts of carbon that could be traded on the carbon market. So although rewilding organizations might be using the Wood and Carbon Code, many representatives from rewilding organizations stressed to me that they were subtly forced to change their land management practices and consultations to receive or maximize carbon income. So there's a commonly referred to phrase in critical social science about carbon forestry that you can't value what you can't measure. Some habitats which are difficult to measure or grow slowly, so they generate very few carbon credits, like wetland margins, high altitude scrub, swampland, are being overlooked or ignored by landowners in favor of planting carbon rich, easier to measure, and faster growing native woodland species like silver birch and oak. One rewilder I spent a lot of time with described this as the creation of ecological islands of native woodland, which are put in the most economically beneficial or accessible place, rather than the most ecologically, economically beneficial place rather than the most ecologically beneficial. So protecting and regenerating pockets of ancient woodland, which Trees for Life are increasingly calling wild trees. It's one of the most important ecological interventions that can be done in Scotland, but that can easily fall through the cracks when woodland creation is financed through just carbon. And more broadly, the uncertainty and surprise that characterizes rewilding and nature restoration don't fit well with the carbon market. The carbon market and the investors purchasing offsets need certainty and standardization, but that doesn't fit well with how ecologies might function. So the CEO of a rewilding NGO really put it well to me in an interview. In his words, the system doesn't allow for any wiggle room. It doesn't allow for any interpretation of the system. The system's rigid. So arguably, when you follow the Woodland Carbon Code, you lose out on the ability to optimize ecological gain. Natural regeneration is an excellent example. You know, it's biologically, ecologically speaking, the most productive way of going about producing native woodland. But there's very, very, very little subsidy in the system to reward landowners for doing it. If you focus on the carbon, inevitably there's a compromise in ecological gain. So with that in mind, I'll turn to the third and last question. What policy levers are required to ensure that investment in nature restoration is scaled up to meet targets? So to me, this question, in answering it, it really frustrated me. To me, it's just a slightly wrong framing of what the question should be. The focus on scaling up investment, i.e., how can we raise money for nature restoration, completely overlooks the far more important question of how the money is actually being spent, which human and non-human communities are benefiting from that money. So to me, a far more interesting framing would be what policy levers are required to improve the delivery of high quality and diverse nature restoration. Well, as the others mentioned, there's two pretty obvious policy levers, regulation and tax. Elsa and Jill provided a really wonderful and in-depth overview that's far more detailed than my little foray here. I'd say probably hands down the most important regulation that many nature restoration organizations I was working with were in favor on was a national limit of deer in Scotland. The incredible effort that goes into creating forests through growing saplings, transporting them, planting them, establishing fencing and other forms of deer management could be perhaps in some way limited if just the browsing pressure on forests was itself limited to allow natural regeneration to occur. The other obvious intervention would be tax reform. Tax reform could redirect private capital from businesses to nature restoration, but bypass the need to make nature appealing to investors, which inevitably comes with limitations and ecological compromises. As the others mentioned, the John Muir Trust's carbon land tax could be a really interesting angle. I just want to conclude with a final point. I think I might have slightly overrun, but I guess worldwide, often narratives about the success and effectiveness of carbon markets are produced by those who stand to gain the most from their successful performance. So this is forestry companies generating credits, companies purchasing credits, and ultimately the state. Governments love carbon markets, offsetting and net zero because they allow business as usual to improve, to continue. Companies produce credits, produce revenue, trees in the economy grow. And this apparent success can convince publics, politicians, and companies that nature restoration is actually being pursued on a wide scale, while more ambitious attempts to mitigate emissions or avoid ecologically degrading practices like sterner financial reforms and tighter environmental regulations are overlooked systematically. Thanks. Sorry, I probably took more than 10 minutes.
That's okay. No, that was really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Theo. I think it was really useful to hear about the gap between public and private funding at a global level, just to contextualize this discussion was really helpful. Also to touch upon the ecological streamlining and also the need to focus, as you rightly challenged my question, on the need for high quality and diverse nature restoration. So that was a really interesting way to finish up this, finish up the presentations. Now, I am conscious of time. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by around 70 of you, which is fantastic, but means we have a lot of questions. So thanks very much for everyone that submitted questions. There are some questions submitted to specific speakers. So in the interest of time, I'll ask the speakers to answer those questions here or following the discussion. And I'll maybe just touch upon a few of the questions that we have that I think could relate to everyone here. Again, in the interest of time, I'll ask you to keep your answers nice and snappy if possible. So there was one question around the amount of money arising from the sale of carbon offsetting units, and how much of this has been spent on measures to reduce emissions from land in Scotland so far. Would anybody like to take that question first of all?
I suppose I could give a go. I suppose a landowner tries to set up a project in order to generate the units and then make a profit. So that's why they're engaging in it. And they want to, first of all, cover their costs in planting trees or peatland restoration, but there needs to be a return. And that's where the incentives come. So that's why people want to do it. There's an income stream. So that's the business model. How much money has been generated by carbon units, we don't actually know because the transactions are private. However, I think around about 25 pounds per carbon unit at the moment. So yeah, Ailsa.
Yeah, no, I think I just pick up on that as well, Jill, that the scheme is not designed to support that income that is generated by carbon credits to be reinvested in nature. Climate. That's absolutely not what it's for. It should be. I completely agree with the questioner that actually these funds should be reinvested in that type of activity. But as Jill's quite rightly said, this is another opportunity for landowners to generate income, perhaps to do really good things, but actually there's no control on that at all. And as Jill's already mentioned, there's no transparency in the market either. So you can have a look at the what credits have been registered. That's publicly available, but who they're selling, how much they're selling for, and who, most importantly, who they're selling to, and whether or not those eventual purchasers have actually sort of reduced their emissions as far as possible before they start offsetting. None of that is controlled. And I think the points that all the speakers have made about the need for more regulation in the market is absolutely critical. And I'll pass on. There's a really fantastic article in the Financial Times this week about who the biggest buyers of carbon offsets are. And I'll put that in the chat. I suspect most of you won't be surprised. Thanks, Miriam.
Not at all. Would anybody else like to come in on that before I move on to the next question? No. Okay. Given that the discussion's on just transition, I think it's right that we've got a question on workforce as well. So we've had a question here on one thing that Jill, you'd mentioned around the fluctuating nature of the workforce on projects. Obviously, in rural Scotland, many areas are facing depopulation, faced with very high land prices, etc., and housing costs remain very unaffordable. Is there any way to use the rise of carbon offsetting to repopulate these places? And what would the ideal impacts for the workforce look like, and how would we set out to achieve that? Would
Yeah,
anybody like?
thank you. I think probably Callum would be well placed to answer this too, I suppose. I think nature restoration and carbon sequestration projects have a fantastic opportunity for employment, where you're thinking about providing opportunities for upskilling and training and focusing on the community, the local communities themselves. So I don't think of nature restoration as kind of putting a fence around things and keeping out people. So I think there is a really amazing opportunity if we're thinking about the benefits again, this benefits being connected much more with the impacts. So you're not just flying, you're not just flying in external experts, but you're thinking about the pipeline of people who really could contribute to these projects in a long way in the future. And I think that could be a really fantastic opportunity.
Great, thank you, Callum.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think again it comes back to what we require along with carbon, and if we require these benefits to happen, then they can if there's money coming in. And I mean, I've benefited from a job in the place near to where I grew up from a project that it hasn't engaged in the market at this point, but is set up in anticipation of it. And I think a good outcome that could arise if handled properly is that it increases the range of jobs available in these places, and I found it really striking what a big pool there is of, well, it's not really surprising, but there is a big pool of young people in these areas who are, raring to go on nature recovery and associated things if the money comes in, which doesn't have to be from carbon markets, but yeah, if handled properly, it's an opportunity.
Great, thank you. We are running very low on time now, so I'll just pick one other question here. There's a question around the ownership of carbon credits. Given the scale of the climate emergency, should they be perhaps be held by the state in public interest as opposed to private owners? So I'll maybe start with Theo or Ailsa.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think it's a really interesting idea, and it really warrants further exploration as to how this could work in practice. And Jill's the expert here about sort of divorcing property rights from property ownership, and how under our current system we can't actually do that, or it's very difficult to do that. So I think that's why we've looked at things like community benefits, and we're also looking at things like a carbon land tax. So there are mechanisms and levers that actually the state can use, but actually trying to divorce ownership of resources that are generated from the land itself is quite a difficult thing to do. You can do it obviously through leases and agreements, but actually forcing that would be quite difficult across the whole country. So I think there are other mechanisms that actually would be much easier to deliver. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that there would be a very difficult technical operation that would go into the state perhaps owning the credits first. A lot of the financing that's coming towards native woodland creation through the code is based on buying pending issuance units, which are effectively a promise to deliver sequestration in the future. I think if companies weren't given that promise that their investment would create offsets in the future, it would be very hard to front up the capital to invest in these projects. And I can't imagine the state digging its hands into its pockets to start financing all these projects across the country. So I wonder if there's a level of, a state-backed pool of carbon credits sounds appealing on one hand, but whether the state financing, if being mobilized at scale, could be redirected in far more nuanced and important ways than going towards creating a cache of carbon credits.
Thank you so much. Callum or Jill, do you want to come on that point before we wrap up?
Yeah, so for me, the carbon units, the ownership of carbon units has not yet been decided yet. So people are doing this trading and money is changing hands, but it's just, as Theo said, based on a promise or based on this kind of theoretical unit of sequestration. And that's where I feel like there could be much more control, much more oversight and regulation in the public interest as to the conditions of when these things are created and the conditions under which transfer takes place and who they're being sold to. Because at the moment there is just none of that, and I think the state could take a much bigger role. I totally agree, Theo. They shouldn't be guaranteeing a floor base carbon price because that is de-risking, as Ailsa said. But just this creation moment, I think, is crucial for having more conditions attached instead of giving away something that really should be managed in the public interest.
Time has absolutely got away with us here, but I would like to just finish up by saying again a huge thank you to each of our speakers. Thank you to Callum, thank you to Theo, thank you to Ailsa, and thank you to Jill. I think you've brought a huge amount of depth to this discussion and really engaged in it. It's such a kind of timely and fast evolving issue in Scotland and beyond. So hugely grateful for your contributions. And finally, a massive thank you to the many, many people who attended and for all of your questions. My apologies that we couldn't get through them all. That was an inevitability, sadly. But it has been brilliant to be with you here this evening and fantastic. We're absolutely delighted to have hosted this webinar. So thank you so much again.